Hello, listeners, and welcome to part 2 of this mini-series on Harold camping and family radio. In part 1, Rachel talked us through her childhood along with her family's dedication to family radio. In part 2, Rachel talks about how these teachings impacted her into adulthood, with part 3 focusing on Rachel's life after camping and healing through anxiety rapture. For early access to full-length ad-free episodes, please visit patreon.com/The Cult Vault to support the show from as little as £1 a month. And now, here is Rachel. So when you receive your free things from Family Radio, are there always sort of like donation slips included in the envelopes that you receive? Like, please give,
Of course
this
there
is
are.
free, but we are happy to accept donations, which is basically like, I don't know. In some ways, that feels
Money.
like that you're being charged, and it would be rude not to give a donation after being sent something for free.
Oh, yes. Not only that, but like at a certain point, every few months, you would just get a donation slip sent to you, just in case you felt like sending something. And they also had advertised, so it wasn't a formal advertisement. The closest thing they got to advertising was them saying, if you want to send us a donation, blah, blah, blah. And I do remember when they started to say, if you would like free information on how to write a living will, contact us today. And there were people who willed everything to family radio. There was at least one I heard of through an article, and this woman's mother had donated all of her savings, all of her money. It went to family radio, and there wasn't legally anything they could have done about it. So, I mean, it wasn't, you have to will everything to us. But on the other hand, if you would like to, because of course the world's going to end. And what if you die before that? What are you leaving behind? It's not for you. And these people in your family, they're not going to live that long anyway. So like maybe we could use it. It was really the whole talking out of both sides of your mouth thing. The whole like, no, you don't have to send us anything, but it would be so great if you did.
That's the big question, I think. Did Harold Camping really know that or really think that he'd predicted the end of the world? Or was it a money-making scheme? Give us all your worldly goods because you no longer need them. Maybe it was a combination of both, but true cult leaders at their core will find a way to exploit vulnerable individuals as much as they can. And if you are convincing people to sell their homes, to sell their cars, to quit their jobs, to give all of their money, to sell their jewelry, to give everything to the church, or to give everything to family radio because you don't need it anymore, is that not the biggest way he could have exploited people that followed his message?
So I would say the only thing that he didn't have a big home. He was wearing old clothes. He drove a car that was not new. Like he wasn't taking all this money home and spending it on himself. And I did look at the tax records for 2011, and they basically spent all the money that they had getting this message out. Now, did he want to use this to build up his radio station and gain fame? And I don't know. Like, I met the man a few times. I don't think that he really was in it for money, because if he had, then, I mean, he was a smart guy. He was an engineer. He was very good with math. If he was in it for money, he really should have spent some of that money sooner. Because by the time 2011 came, he had a stroke not long after the rapture was supposed to happen, and he died like 2 years later. So he was 92 when he died. He was old when all of this happened. Like, I would think logically, if he was in it for money, he would have spent it sooner, and he would have kept more of it for himself. I think he did believe the things that he was saying. At least I think he believed most of them. But also I think he really enjoyed the ride that he got taken on. I remember at a conference, for instance, and now looking back on it, I'm like, yeah, of course. There were so many men there who were either divorced or they were like middle-aged and perpetually single. And they would ask him all these questions. Oh, Mr. Camping, we have a question for you. Oh, can we sit with you at lunch? Oh, can we just like have a little conversation with you? Or like, well, can't, you have said this, and like, I really want to make sure I'm making the right decision, so I'm coming to you. And Camping would be like, well, you got to go to God, but here are all these verses that I recommend. Let's read them together. And Camping had a lot of power that wasn't manifested financially. So, for instance, one guy actually got up at the conferences. They would record the open forum, so we who were there got to ask questions. It was almost always men asking the questions, and he would answer them. They would record it, and that would be the open forum for 2 weeks from then. They would have it ready to go for open forum, so they he could take like a week off or something. But I remember these two guys standing up. They were not 10 feet in front of me, and you could tell they were like not scheming, but they had been thinking about this for a while. And they said, Mr. Camping, we know that women are not allowed to teach men the Bible. Like, we know women are not allowed to preach to men. If a woman asks a question about the Bible, or asks a question, and everything pertains to the Bible. So like, if a woman asks a question and it makes a man think, and he learns something by thinking about that question, has she not taught him something? And therefore, should we not allow women to ask questions? And he actually thought about it. I'm like, the answer should be no. But I remember sitting there thinking, really considering it and feeling like garbage, because I'm a smart woman. I have a PhD now. Like, I'm intelligent, and like, for somebody to say like, you're a woman, and because of this long logical trail I've built for myself, I've decided you shouldn't even ask a question. You should just go along with what the men say. And Camping said, he paused, and then he said, no, I don't think that we need to go that far. And I remember kind of breathing a sigh of relief. But like, the fact that he held the room waiting for his answer, and then we were just going to follow whatever he said, because we believed that God was giving him some truth, and through, like, we were seeing what was coming out of the Bible, because and Camping was helping guide us through that. We didn't believe we were following him. We believed we were following God, but that God was opening our eyes and Harold Camping's eyes to this message. So whatever he had said, we were going to do. And I remember talking to my husband about it years later, and he said, yeah, that's such a stupid question. And I was like, yeah, but none of the men stood up and said, that's a stupid question. Why would you say that? And none of the women felt safe to do that. So my husband was under a spell, I think just as much as I was, but it affected him differently, because as a man, he got to have autonomy and make choices. And but I think that's more of how Camping wielded his power. It was, whatever I say goes, but I'm not going to take responsibility for it. I'm going to say that's between you and God. So then that's my little asterisk disclaimer, and now I can't be held accountable for it.
That's the danger with one person's directions, instructions, opinions being taken so seriously by a group of devout followers. Because if he would have turned around and said, yes, women should be seen and not heard in all cases, who knows today what conditions some women or individuals would be living in, given that could have just been referenced. Well, Harold Camping said on this day at this time that this is how women should be, I don't know, in air quotes, dealt with, I suppose. And we know from other conversations that have happened on this show that in some conservative Christian groups, this is exactly the mentality that exists. So yes, a sigh of relief that he did not go down that route. I can imagine that was a tense time for all the people in the room, that all the women in the room at that time. And
well, yeah, and he already had it, so he was saying, birth control is not biblical. So I mean, you had women in that room there was one who had, I believe, 19 children.
Oh,
And then her oldest daughter had already had 3 or 4. And you had families that, like, on the small side were 4 or 5 children, and on the large side we're talking like 10 plus. That was very common. So, like, these women are not, they're not having jobs, and their older children are totally parentified because nobody can raise that many children
no.
practically. Like, that's not, um yeah, that's not okay. um was it 19? It might have only been 15 at the time. I don't At a
Only
certain
15.
point, that's a lot of children. Like, it doesn't really matter. um yeah, only 15, that's all. But there are other ways that are, like, women are being controlled and tied down. And so then to say, well, you also don't get to speak, like, that would have made it so much worse. But, like, this guy was not a feminist in any way, shape, or form. We'll just say that. Like, as cults go, it followed the culty tradition of, women don't really get a say, which is very common in not even just religious cults, in so many cults.
I think I've said it a few times that a lot of these a lot of these conditions that exist in high demand groups are there for the purpose of men having their cake and eating it. Some
Yeah.
groups where you can't get divorced, but also men can practice polyamory and polygamy, but women cannot. So the women just have to kind of accept the fact that the man is sleeping around with all these women and she can't divorce him. And she is, in God's eyes, supposed to just be happy with that.
Yeah, yeah. We definitely were not into, it was one man and one woman. But then it was, if you're gay, you're not welcome here. If you're LGBTQ, no, you are not welcome here because you are sinning and God hates you. That was the message, period. Um, and it didn't take me long after leaving to step into the world and see, like, no, that's just stupid. That's just
Yeah,
stupidity,
yeah.
and it's cruel. You know.
Of course, when we talk in terms of conservative Christianity, when we talk about men and women, we are talking in the very black and white binary terms of Christianity, where it's not always recognized that the world is not as binary as men and women. It fluctuates, it varies. It's a lot more I'd say exciting. It's a lot more exciting than
Yeah.
just two things. So
Yeah.
so of course when we say that there were a lot of women in the room who were probably holding their breath waiting for his answer. I imagine whenever there was any type of rhetoric or talk around the LGBTQIA plus community, that there were a lot of individuals in the room also feeling the way that women had felt when he'd spoken about things in an oppressive way. So it is important to highlight that as well.
Yeah. And also the young people. These are not just adults who are here. We have 3, 4, and 5-year-olds who are sitting in the conferences, who are listening to this just as, and they are this isn't like the church I grew up in where you give them a coloring book to, by the time, because they are young. This is, you are expected to sit there and listen. And if you can write, you are expected to take notes. You are internalizing this in a major way. And these are young people who, I am sure there were a bunch of them who are not, cis straight people. There's a spectrum of people out there, and they were younger than I was, and they're listening to this and probably internalizing it. I would imagine so, because there's, I had heard about, I didn't know this family in particular, but there were some children who the parents had family radio playing 24 hours a day. So even while they're sleeping, it's on in the background on low. You can't escape in that. That is oppressive. That's abusive. really. And so even though the conferences only happened like once a year, and they stopped after a certain period of time because they're like, well, these are expensive to put on, even though people are paying to come. So let's just spend that money to like, send people to different countries to hand out tracts, things like that. Pay more translators to get the tracts in as many languages as possible. So even though the conferences were only once a year for a certain period of time, it was still like, it was a week of intensely being in this environment. And then you would go home and you were still intensely in the environment because the world's going to end. Like, time is up. So you have to make the most of what you have. And I remember going to the grocery store, and it's like having a countdown clock over your head with a bomb attached to you. It just feels, I remember thinking like, this is my last birthday. This is my last Christmas. This is the last time I will buy ice cream. This is the last time I'm going out to eat. I don't need to have food in my fridge for very long because I will not be here. And it was wild. Like, on leading up to, I guess so I've talked about like what happened leading up to like 2011, but the year 2011 was the worst. It was the worst year of my life.
So before we head into that section, a quick kind of overview of your experiences up to that point was always having Harold camping in your life. And you can remember being as young as 6 and being very much aware of Harold Camping and his teachings, and very excited to offer corrections in Bible study. When you're 6 years old, you want to be making people proud. You want people to be saying, yeah, you've got it. That's the right answer.
Yeah.
So as a child, you're expressing your excitement for understanding the scripture and the messages. I'm sure your dad was excited for that in the house when you would say, "Yes, Dad, I know all of this stuff." And then you find a Presbyterian church to join, which is in line with Harold Camping's suggestion. And you remain a part of that church until he reverses that and says, "Okay, let's leave church now." So,
Yeah. So we left probably in 2003. It was March 2003. So even though he had started speaking about the end of the church age in like late 2001, because my dad wanted us to do a long Bible study of the book of Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, which are like an account of approximately the same story, which was the basis for the end of the church age, for that teaching of camping. So Dad had us go through these verses and compare them in each book. And at the end of it, so we had done this for over a year, and he's like, okay, so we're all in agreement. We have to leave church. And we're all like, what? So I was a high schooler then, and I had joined the church like 2 years previously, like around the time camping had started preaching this. And my dad didn't stop me, but I don't know. I think he was kind of biding his time. So then we finally get to the end of this like over year-long Bible study, and my dad is like, okay, so we're going to leave the church, right? We all agree that's what this is saying. And we're like, wait, what? And he's like, we've been talking about this for over a year. And I'm like, not explicitly. So then he explains, I think he really wanted us to read the passage and come up with that answer on our own. The funny thing looking back is he didn't even have that experience because he had camping telling him what these verses meant, right? So he was expecting us to do something that even he hadn't done. And I don't know. But like once he had said, well, this means this and this is referencing that, and here's what, if you look at like this Greek word and these other places it appears in the Bible and we compare it, this is what it's really talking about. And once he said that, I was like, yeah, I buy that. Like that lines up. And then we left, the church in early 2003. Um, and we had been at that Presbyterian church since I was like 2.5, 3 years old. And yeah, so we had been there a long time. We had been there since the late 80s, really since the end of the church age had started, kind of, if you look at the timeline. So yeah, it was, I think any time in there, my dad would say he was just following the Bible, but camping was always on in the background.
So that's the thing about the interpretation of certain parts of the Bible. I think any of us could read any part of the Bible and interpret it in some way. And that's why so many different variations of Christianity exist today. And there'll be so many that look like one another, but they'll have a slight difference in a belief around one line in the Bible. And that could be all it takes to separate one group from another.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So
Like
it's
Christian scientists like base. I listened to the interview you did, but I had known a couple when I was younger through school, and it would all seem to hinge on like one little difference, but it made such a huge difference in their lives.
and I think that anybody can explain their interpretation to you and it make perfect sense. So that's, as you've explained, what's happened here. And you mentioned that you were part of the Bible study for, a couple of years before your father was like, okay, now we're going to leave. So you mentioned earlier in the interview that to be chosen, you have to hear the word of God. To know that you're chosen, you have to hear this. Is this something that you experienced, or was this something that left you wondering if you were doing something wrong because it was something others were experiencing, but you weren't?
Yeah, that's a great question. I still don't know what happened. I've had this discussion with a couple other people who were also raised in the same group, who I still know personally, because we're family. But we've all since left. And at least these people that I've spoken to, I still have some family members that are in the offshoot of the cult. But for me, it would say, you know, if God says by their fruits ye shall know them. So by your works, we can kind of tell if God has changed your heart or not. But doing good works doesn't indicate that you're saved. You can't do enough good works to earn your salvation. And just because you're a good person doesn't mean you're saved. But if you are following the Bible, if you are leaving the church, if you are listening to this, if you do believe God's coming back, that's an indicator that God has worked in your heart. But I always did well, do I believe it because I've been taught it, or do I believe it because God has worked in my heart? I don't know. But we were not allowed to not know. That was maddening. I think, especially when like you grow up with this, like the truth is whatever the adults in your life say it is. It's when this is how you grow up. I mean, there are other ways of raising kids where you can allow them to explore and find things on their own, but there was no exploring happening. It was, this is what it is. So it was always this cyclic thing of, do I believe it because I've been taught it? Do I believe it because God's changed my heart? And for me, I think also with my personality, and not really knowing what love was, because God's love was not guaranteed, as I said before. Wondering and just thinking like, well, I know I'm sinful in some ways. And yeah, I know that I'm not going to be perfect in this life, but am I so sinful that I'm indicating that I'm not saved? And for me, it was always like, I should probably still worry about my salvation just in case I'm not saved, so that I pray harder, so that I beg God for mercy harder, I cry louder. I literally would just sob every morning. Like, reading the Bible is still hard for me because first of all, I can hear it in Harold Camping's voice because I heard him read it so many times. Second of all, because it was always traumatic for me reading the Bible. It was always, and I know people might think that that's me blowing it up, but really, like, sitting down and reading it, I was coming face to face with my own mortality in some ways. That's what it felt like. It felt like this was do or die, and that if I end up in hell, if I end up separated from the love of God, that is my fault. And this is what cults do. Anything bad, anything that ends up not going right is your fault. Anything that goes well is because of God or the leader or some combination, or anything that is not you because you are the worst. And that was, I still don't know exactly what I believed. And I still, right, like, I'm finally to a point in my life where I'm okay saying, I don't know. I don't know.
Sounds as if the goalposts are always moving. And if you were feeling that way, I imagine everybody felt that way too. It's by design that you throw yourself in harder. Like, oh, I'm having doubts. Okay, why don't you chant 100 times more a day? I'm having doubts. Oh, why don't you go sit down with the Bible for an extra 3 hours a day?
Yeah.
Whatever the tactic looks like, the outcome is the same. You dedicate just a little bit more of your time in your life to the cause. And as a child, so overwhelming. As an adult, kind of even more so, especially if you because you're in the world. I say in air quotes, you're in the world, but as you said, you're also kind of just floating through it. You're not in an intentional community or a commune or a compound that's isolated from the outside world, but you also could well have been with the same influence that this was having over your life.
Yeah. Mentally,
Especially
mentally we were in a compound. Like, mentally we were in a
especially
commune.
leading up to the dates that camping gave you and the effects that that had on your life. So you leave, you officially, finally, you do leave the church, your high school age, and at some point you meet your husband. This is at a Harold camping event.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I went to college, which was like, I got so much guff for going to college, except for my dad was very supportive. He's like, no, there's still time. Like, you should go to college. Um, but a lot of people in the group were, why are you wasting your time and money? Like, going to college, especially when you're a woman, but also the world's gonna end. And yeah, my husband and I met at one of the conferences. It was the to second to last conference. Yeah. And we met briefly. We did not exchange any information, but then there was an online program. I don't know if it exists anymore, but it was called Pal Talk. It was like AOL Instant Messenger, but it had different rooms. I don't know if you've heard of it or used it, or maybe some of the listeners have, but you could go in a virtual room and somebody would have the microphone and it was just all audio and you would hear this person talking. And there were several of these for followers of Harold Camping. And there were a couple of them where it was like, I just sort of like ended up being in one more than another just because the guy who was speaking was a little bit less gruff, a little bit more, um, like, he still had a sense of humor, which is something that felt like it was really lost in what we were all doing. And my husband showed up, my now husband, and he has a very unique last name, and so and he his username included his last name. So I messaged him and I was like, hey, is this, or did I meet you at the conference? And he said yes. And we got to talking, and within a few months we found out through somebody that we both had, feelings for each other. And so we started dating long distance, because we were in two different time zones. And after 11 months, he proposed, and 5 months after that, we got married, and then we moved in together, and We were no longer long distance. I was 22 when we got married. And I look back at that and I just see somebody who was looking for security. I just I was I got married like very soon after I graduated. I graduated early. I just wanted I didn't even feel secure enough in myself to try and like get a career. I did have some jobs like between when we got married and 2011, but I just didn't feel like I was so depressed. Um and it was really hard. I thankfully I ended up marrying somebody who has also come a long way. Like we've both come a long way individually, but also together since then. We're still together. Um, we are, have been married for almost 15 years now and have really become each other's partners. But I would say, like, when we were first married, I loved him, but I was so grateful he came along because I think I needed to move. I needed to get away from some people in my life, but I also I could have easily fallen into the trap of marrying somebody who was going to be very controlling and who would have, um, there were some people in the cult who were after me in a like constantly emailing me kind of way, constantly on Facebook messaging me kind of way. I'm like, you aren't pregnant yet. Why not? Why aren't you pregnant yet? And because they thought I must be sinning because I'm not having a baby yet. And he was very supportive during that time and very understanding. But I know there are a lot of people in the cult who weren't and who would not have been. So yeah, I got
It's so
married
much
really
pressure
young.
though. It's like the
Oh
world's
yeah,
ending, don't get a job, don't fill your fridge up, but at the same time, you should consider having children. Why would
definitely
you,
be
what if
making
you think the
babies.
world, yeah, why would you want to be bringing babies into the world if you think that
Um,
it's gonna burn up in a
God
big
in camping said so. Basically, I mean, right now, from what I understand, in the cult offshoot, it's run by a guy named Chris McCann called E Bible Fellowship. And last I heard, because I kind of keep tabs on what they're doing roughly, because I know there's still some people in there, and I want um, I still care about these people, right? But um, the things he said, he's like, well, after 2011, God stopped saving people. And people were like, well, I've had a baby. I had a baby in 2013. And he's like, well, that child has no hope of salvation. God simply made this child to exist and to eventually be destroyed at the end of the world. And that's part of God's plan. That's part of the glory of God. And it's like and people follow this. It's like you're telling people that this child exists to be killed by a deity. Okay. I have a really hard time with that. Like you can see I'm kind of pulling my hair out. Like I this is not okay. I don't know how we live with ourselves saying this. Um so it's just a continuation of the same thing of like, well, God expects, don't get in God's way by using birth control, have as many children. We're supposed to be fruitful and multiply, so we need to do that, and we need to not question um, if it's responsible to bring a child into the world right now, if it's the best thing to do, and we need to just blindly follow. And people are still doing that. But I just have so many issues with that. I have issues with a lot of things, but like these are living, breathing beings with feeling. And for you to believe that like they're here and like because God wants them to be, and that's where your responsibility ends as long as you're shoving the Bible down their throat. And that's all that matters. That's not okay.
especially when babies are the most vulnerable of all people. They talk about, the fourth trimester because babies can't move. They can't
Right.
they can't eat. they can't wind themselves. Everything has to be, taken care of on the
Yeah.
baby's behalf. You have to help them for a very, very, very long time after they're born.
Yeah.
Years and years. You have to help humans develop. And when babies are first born, I know that there are some bits of doctrine that will say that, everybody's born with sin. But if there are any pure beings in the world, surely they should be babies because I mean, I know like born out of sin, if you're talking about wedlock and everything, but babies are so small that they can't be taking part in anything that might make them sinful. So if there are any truly pure beings in the world, it's got to be tiny babies, hasn't it? So
You'd
to
think
give the
so.
opposite
Harold
message of
Camping had a lot to say about that, but just like it's not just the outward act of sin, it's that your heart is sinful. And so babies' hearts are just as sinful as anybody else's. And also that there was an indication that I forget who it was. I think it was John the Baptist was probably saved before he was born because he leaped in his mother's womb for joy, hearing about the news that Jesus was conceived. And so if he can be saved in the womb, then you can also be sinful in the womb, and everybody's conceived being
oh
having a sinful heart.
gosh.
So yes,
So
even
no
I,
one
I mean,
stands a
and that
chance.
it just there's like no hope for anybody, right? Like,
Yeah.
there is hope because it's God's choice, and God will save people, and He can save babies. So saying babies don't have sin actually takes away how like wonderful it is if God can save them. And it was like if the only way babies can't read the Bible, right? So if they have to hear the word of God to be saved, people were putting like family radio on all the time around their babies because that was the only way they would have hope of salvation. And nobody ever stopped to think like, is this healthy? Is this okay? Is this making any sense? Because I also have to say like when there's a time clock, like a countdown clock over your head, you do a lot of things you would not normally do. And I think that was a huge part of it.
Well, you said that you were looking for security when you met your husband, and he just so happened to turn out to actually be a really great guy.
Yeah.
And in hindsight, with this situation coming down on you, you've said there's a chance that you could have become involved with somebody that turned out to not be a good person, or maybe just not a good person for you. Do you think that that security was that you were looking for somebody to go into the rapture with, or you were looking for somebody that might perhaps support you if it didn't happen? Like, were these the sorts of thoughts that you were having?
So for one, I had noticed that he like let me have an opinion and appreciated what I had to say. So that was great. You absolutely were not allowed to marry outside of the cult. So like at one point there was somebody in my family who thought, there might be something to this, and he decided to marry somebody who did not agree, and we did not my dad's like we are not going to their wedding. One of them might be saved, one of them might believe this, the other doesn't. They're unequally yoked. We cannot support that. And so we didn't go to this wedding. And we didn't even question that. We were like, oh, I don't even know if I want to speak to this person. And it's like, no, they're still in our family. We still care about them, but they're really making a huge mistake. So like, I knew there is no way I was marrying somebody outside of this group because that felt unsafe at the time. Now I look at it and I'm like, I'm glad I ended up with who I ended up with. Some things do work out just fine. But like absolutely there were people that I was interested in outside of the group, and I really was very upset because they didn't believe the same things I did, and so I didn't pursue that. And I didn't really have any indication that they liked me anyway, so that really didn't matter. But it was like automatically no to so many people, and it really narrows down who's available to you. And a lot of cults do this, right? Like they want to keep everybody in the group
In
unless
the
you're
family.
Yeah, and the family, unless you're going to like drag them into the group with you, and then maybe consider it, you know. So yeah, I wanted to be with somebody who like valued me for who I was, but also I was not going to pursue somebody outside of the group. And you know, I did get that with my husband. And I am very fortunate that we basically left around the same time, and we kind of left in the same way, which was basically like stepping back and stepping back and stepping back until finally it's like, I haven't listened to this in months and I feel fine. Um, you know, so yeah.
You talked about meeting each other and getting married quite soon afterwards. Was this something that was in keeping with the kind of MO of Harold Camping and his followers, or was it something that you did out of fear of the end times?
It was very, I know some other couples who got together in the group and got married. I'm thinking of one in particular. And the only reason they didn't get married as quickly as we did is because one was a citizen of a different country and was going to get American citizenship. And that was a whole long process.
Right.
Um, so, but otherwise, like they got married ASAP. Um, I would say there was also like a don't waste your time mentality. Like, don't pursue somebody if you don't see yourself marrying them, because like dating is super serious. And also like there were purity culture was kind of at its height too. So even the secular Christians I knew were like, all these, you know, young women were like, well, I can't pursue a man, he has to pursue me. And I still know one who like waited until her mid 30s to finally date because she was waiting for somebody to ask her. She wouldn't like ask them because she felt like that was God's plan. Which like, if that you want to like live your life, but purity culture was huge. So even, you know, among casual Christians, and the whole concept of like I kissed dating goodbye, and so there were shades of that in the way that Camping pursued things. And he didn't have to give his blessing or anything like that, but like he definitely would say, you know, you should not, if you want to marry somebody who doesn't, you know, believe this, then you have to question whether you believe it too. And then therefore you're questioning your salvation and all of that. So people, I think like a lot of similar Christian cults and strict Christian um, religions or religious backgrounds, a lot of people end up getting married quickly because there's so much. There's so many people who like they want to be intimate. They want to, you know, they want to be together, and they still don't want to pursue. They still want to do it within the confines of what they're given. So with what they're given is marriage. So that's what they do. Um, I think for us there was a little bit of a like, yeah, the world's gonna end. Are we gonna do this or are we just not going to? Like, we never said like, should we do it? Flip a coin. Like, we really wanted to be together. And so it was sort of like, then what are we waiting for? We only have X amount of time.
Right, right. Whereas I feel like in other circumstances, the kind of the height of a hormone fluctuation in terms of sexual desire. It's around about a peak 18 to 22. So I can see
Yeah.
why a lot of young people might be considering ma getting married
Yeah.
early, if that's the only way that they can be intimate with one another.
Well, and like I'll say for us, it was maybe not as much driven by that in part. My husband's 31, or was 31 when we got married, so he's 9 years older than I am. And he was very cognizant of like, he's like, I don't want to seem like I'm just interested in you because you're young. I don't he's like, yes, you're an adult. He's like, he had thought at that point he was going to be single forever. And then like on my end, I'm more of like a gray sexual or a demisexual. So I'm not like Like, sex was never going to drive me to be with somebody, even at that age. So we did want to be together, but it was more like, you know, what are we waiting for, kind of thing. Whereas if we had more time, I think it would have been, we would have taken our time a little bit more. I probably would have felt free to pursue a job and like move, or he could have moved, or, you know, something like that, instead of like, let's just do this.
That is the end of part 2 of this mini-series on Harold Camping and Family Radio. To support the show from as little as £1 a month, please visit patreon.com/thecultvault. And to get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com, or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault Podcast.